spring of 1863, the Union Army of the Potomac, still reeling from its devastating loss at Fredericksburg in December 1862, stood at a crossroads. The air was heavy with the bitter sting of defeat, and the soldiers' spirits sagged under the weight of failure. Enter Major General Joseph Hooker, a man whose fiery determination and unyielding ambition breathed new life into the weary ranks. Known for his aggressive tactics and reformist zeal, Hooker was tasked with a monumental challenge: to revive a demoralized army and lead it to victory against the formidable Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by General Robert E. Lee. With meticulous care, Hooker reorganized the army, streamlining its structure and bolstering its supply lines. He walked among the troops, his voice ringing with encouragement, rekindling their resolve and transforming despair into determination. His plan was nothing short of audacious, a cunning campaign to outmaneuver Lee's forces by striking at their vulnerabilities. Hooker envisioned a multi-pronged assault. A substantial force would cross the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers west of Fredericksburg, slicing through Lee's supply lines like a blade, forcing the Confederate general into an open battle where Union numbers could prevail. Meanwhile, a smaller contingent under General John Sedgwick would engage Lee's forces at Fredericksburg, pinning them down and preventing reinforcements from bolstering the Confederate main body. Across the river, in the Confederate camp, General Robert E. Lee faced a dire situation. His Army of Northern Virginia, though triumphant at Fredericksburg, was a shadow of its former strength. Outnumbered nearly 2-to-1, undersupplied and stretched thin, Lee's men were weary, their uniforms threadbare and their rations meager. Yet Lee's brilliance lay not in numbers, but in his audacity and tactical genius. The dense, tangled wilderness of Spotsylvania, with its thick underbrush and shadowy trails, became his ally. He planned to use its labyrinthine terrain to nullify the Union's numerical advantage, turning the forest into a deadly trap where his smaller force could strike with precision. Every decision Lee made was a calculated risk, his mind racing to anticipate Hooker's next move, his resolve unshaken despite the odds stacked against him. As the battle loomed, the Army of the Potomac, under Hooker's command, boasted an imposing 134 men and 413 guns, a juggernaut of manpower and firepower. In contrast, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia mustered only 60,298 men and 220 guns, a David facing a Goliath. On April 27th, the Union's campaign began with a surge of momentum. 3 corps, led by the steady hand of General Henry Slocum, marched with purpose, their boots kicking up dust along the roads leading to Chancellorsville. By April 30th, they converged on the hamlet of Chancellorsville, a sleepy crossroads marked by a single imposing brick mansion at the junction of the Orange Turnpike and Orange Plank Road. The mansion, its red brick walls glowing in the late afternoon sun, became Hooker's headquarters. As he surveyed the surrounding fields, Hooker's heart swelled with confidence. The Confederates had offered little resistance to the river crossings, and the operation's early success fueled his belief that victory was within reach. That night, he ordered General Daniel Sickles to move the 3rd Corps from Falmouth, their campfires flickering like stars against the darkening Virginia sky. By May 1st, Hooker had amassed approximately 70,000 men in and around Chancellorsville, their tents dotting the landscape like a sprawling city. The Federals had met no significant opposition, and the ease of their advance emboldened the troops. Yet, in a moment that would haunt the campaign, Hooker halted his advance, choosing to wait for additional reinforcements. The decision sent a ripple of unease through the ranks. Federal officers, their faces etched with frustration, urged Hooker to press forward, sensing the fleeting opportunity to crush Lee before he could regroup. The momentum they had built, like a river in full flood, began to stall, and the soldiers' earlier confidence gave way to murmurs of doubt. Meanwhile, Confederate General Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson, Lee's most trusted lieutenant, was already setting the stage for a daring countermove. In the pre-dawn hours of May the 1st, Jackson left the Fredericksburg lines, his horse's hooves pounding the earth as he rode toward Zoar Church. 5 hours later, he arrived to find 2 divisions of Confederate infantry under Major General Richard H. Anderson and Major General Lafayette McLaws. They were fortifying a ridge that overlooked the turnpike and plank road, their shovels biting into the earth with rhythmic precision. Jackson, his eyes blazing with resolve, wasted no time. Though his full corps had not yet arrived, he ordered Anderson and McLaws to abandon their entrenchments, shoulder their rifles, and advance. His audacity, a hallmark of his legend, shaped the Battle of Chancellorsville into a contest of wills, where boldness would outweigh numbers. Late that morning, Hooker authorized an eastward push along the turnpike and plank road. The Union troops, their bayonets gleaming in the sunlight, moved forward with cautious optimism, but they soon collided with a Confederate resistance far fiercer than anticipated. The crack of rifles and the roar of cannon fire shattered the morning calm, catching Union frontline commanders off guard. Frantic messages flooded back to Hooker, their urgency palpable. Shaken by the unexpected ferocity, Hooker ordered his generals to retreat to the wilderness and dig in. By late afternoon, the Union troops were constructing entrenchments around Chancellorsville, their shovels carving deep furrows into the earth as they encircled Hooker's headquarters. Major General Darius Couch, the Army's senior corps commander, approached Hooker, his face a mask of concern. Couch had championed an offensive strategy, and his frustration mirrored that of his fellow officers. "It is all right, Couch," Hooker said, his voice steady but tinged with defiance. "I have got Lee just where I want him. He must fight me on my own ground." The words hung in the air, a bold claim that masked the growing unease in the Union camp. As night fell, Confederate scouts crept through the shadows, verifying the strength of the Union's fortifications. From the Rappahannock River to the open fields of Hazel Grove, the Federal lines appeared impregnable. A frontal assault would be suicidal for Lee's outnumbered army. But salvation came in the form of intelligence delivered by Lee's cavalry chief, Jeb Stuart. Under the flickering light of a campfire, Stuart revealed a critical weakness. The Union's right flank was utterly exposed, a vulnerability that could turn the tide. Lee and Jackson seized the moment, their minds racing with possibilities. Before dawn, they pored over a hastily drawn map, its crude lines illuminated by lantern light. They devised a plan of breathtaking audacity, one of the boldest in American military history. Jackson's corps, numbering some 30,000 men, would embark on a perilous flanking march through the wilderness, following obscure country roads and hidden paths to strike the Union's unprotected right. Lee, with just 14,000 infantry, would hold a 3-mile front, distracting Hooker's forces and buying Jackson time. The Army of Northern Virginia would be split into 3 fragile fragments, including General Jubal Early's contingent at Fredericksburg, each vulnerable to destruction if the Union pressed its advantage. At first light on May 2nd, Jackson led his column through the Confederate bivouac, his presence electrifying the troops. After a brief, intense conference with Lee, he spurred his horse down the Furnace Road, his eyes alight with the fire of battle. The Federals soon detected the movement, and reports reached Hooker's headquarters, Initially, Hooker correctly surmised that Jackson aimed to strike his right flank. He warned Major General Oliver Howard, commander of the 11th Corps, to brace for an attack from the west. But as the morning wore on, Hooker's confidence wavered. The wilderness's dense thickets obscured Confederate movements, and he began to believe Lee was retreating rather than flanking. Dismissing his earlier concerns, Hooker ordered Sickles' 3rd Corps to harass what he thought was the tail of Lee's withdrawing army. Sickles, commanding the 3rd Corps, launched a mid-afternoon assault along an unfinished railroad. The Union troops, their shouts echoing through the trees, overwhelmed a Confederate rearguard, capturing nearly an entire Georgia regiment. The victory, though small, drew significant Union forces away from the right, leaving Howard's 11th Corps isolated and vulnerable. Meanwhile, Jackson's column pressed forward through the wilderness, navigating uncharted trails with relentless determination. To maintain the illusion of retreat, Jackson twice veered his march away from the Union lines, deceiving Hooker's scouts. The grueling trek, spanning over 12 miles, tested the endurance of his men, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. By 3 p.m., Jackson's troops reached their destination and began forming battle lines astride the turnpike, their front stretching nearly 2 miles, a formidable wall of gray ready to unleash havoc. Despite warnings from individual Union officers and soldiers, the 11th Corps headquarters dismissed reports of Jackson's approach as exaggerated fears. Hooker's limited cavalry, hampered by the wilderness's dense terrain, failed to confirm the Confederate presence. Only 2 small regiments and half a New York battery faced west, woefully unprepared for what was coming. At Jackson's signal, his corps burst from the trees, their rebel yells piercing the air as they charged the unsuspecting Union troops. It was pandemonium, a Massachusetts soldier later recalled, his voice trembling with the memory. On the side of the road, it was chaos. Howard's men fought valiantly, forming 3 desperate battle lines to stem the Confederate tide, but their position was untenable. The gray-clad legions, driven by Jackson's relentless will, overwhelmed each stand, driving the 11th Corps from the field in a rout that left the ground littered with discarded rifles and tattered blue coats. As dusk fell, the disorganization among Jackson's troops forced him to halt the advance around 7:50 p.m. Unwilling to relinquish the initiative, he summoned Major General A.P. Hill's division to the front, determined to press the attack under cover of darkness. As Hill's brigades maneuvered into position, Jackson rode ahead to scout the Union lines, his silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. Tragedy struck when he attempted to return. A North Carolina regiment, mistaking his party for Union cavalry, opened fire. Jackson fell, wounded, and the Confederate cause suffered a grievous blow. He would succumb to his injuries 8 days later, leaving a void in Lee's command. Yet, on May the 2nd, Hooker still held the upper hand. Reinforcements arrived overnight, and Sickles' 3rd Corps reoccupied Hazel Grove, strengthening the Union position. The Confederate commanders, now under Jeb Stuart's leadership, recognized the need to unify their scattered forces. At dawn on May 3rd, Stuart launched a ferocious assault on Hazel Grove. To their surprise, they found Sickles' men withdrawing in an orderly retreat, as Hooker had ordered them to abandon the key terrain and fall back to Fairview. The Confederates seized the opportunity, positioning 31 cannons on Hazel Grove's crest. Combined with artillery along the turnpike, they unleashed a thunderous bombardment that shook the earth, pounding Fairview with relentless fury. The Federals countered with 34 guns of their own, their cannon fire lighting up the morning sky in a deadly duel. The bloodiest fighting erupted between 6:30 and 9:30 a.m. on May 3rd. Confederate brigades, their battle flags snapping in the breeze, charged the entrenched Union lines along the turnpike. The fighting was brutal, a back-and-forth struggle that left the ground stained with blood. The tide began to turn as Union artillery, starved of ammunition, fell silent one by one. Hooker, inexplicably, failed to reinforce his lines or resupply his cannons, a lapse that baffled his subordinates. Disaster compounded when a Confederate projectile struck a pillar at the Chancellorsville mansion, hurling Hooker to the ground and leaving him dazed. Stunned and unable to command, he was effectively removed from the battle, leaving his army leaderless at a critical moment. The Confederates pressed their advantage, advancing first to Fairview and then toward the remaining Union positions at Chancellorsville. Lee's wing, attacking from the south and east, joined the assault, their cheers echoing as they recognized their commander's genius. Lee, his face etched with determination, prepared to pursue Hooker and cement his victory. But a courier from Fredericksburg brought devastating news. Union forces had broken through, threatening the Confederate rear. The situation demanded immediate action. Lee assigned Stuart to monitor Hooker's army and dispatched McLaws eastward to confront the new threat. At Salem Church, 4 miles west of Fredericksburg, the retreating Confederates joined McLaws' forces. A Union assault met a fierce counterattack, driving the Federals back and ending the day's fighting. The following day, Lee pushed the Union across the Rappahannock at Banks Ford, refocusing his attention on Hooker's main army in the wilderness. But Hooker, shaken by the mounting losses and his own injury, had lost his nerve. Despite protests from his corps commanders, who urged him to fight on, he ordered a retreat. Under the cover of darkness, the Union Army withdrew, crossing the river and reaching Stafford County by May 6th. The defeat was bitter, but not decisive enough to end the war. Remarkably, 40,000 Federal troops had seen no combat, a testament to Hooker's faltering leadership. The Union suffered over 17,000 casualties, while the Confederates lost 13,000. Lee's triumph at Chancellorsville was a masterpiece of strategy and daring, fueling his belief in the invincibility of his army. Emboldened, he persuaded the Richmond government to support an ambitious offensive into Pennsylvania. Within 6 weeks, the Army of Northern Virginia, brimming with confidence, marched north toward a fateful encounter at Gettysburg, where the tide of the war would hang in the balance.